The year was 1258, and the sun seemed to have set on the civilized world. To the east, the Tigris River ran black with the ink of scholars and red with the blood of the innocent. Baghdad, the jewel of the Islamic Golden Age, the city of 1,001 nights, had not just fallen, it had been obliterated. The House of Wisdom, a library containing centuries of human knowledge, was trampled into the mud by the hooves of shaggy ponies. For the people of the Middle East, this was not merely a military defeat. It felt like the apocalypse. The Mongols had arrived, and they appeared to be a force of nature, a punishment from the heavens that could neither be reasoned with nor stopped. They had swept across Asia with a speed and ferocity that defied comprehension, erasing empires and leaving pyramids of skulls in their wake. Now, the smoke of burning Baghdad drifted westward, carrying with it a terrifying message to the remaining powers of the Mediterranean: you are next. At the helm of this juggernaut was Hulagu Khan, grandson of the legendary Genghis. He had been given a mandate by the great Khan Monka to subdue the world as far as the borders of Egypt. Having crushed the assassins in their mountain fortresses and annihilated the Abbasid Caliphate, Hulagu turned his gaze towards Syria and the Levant. The psychological terror inflicted by the Mongols was their most potent weapon. Stories of their brutality traveled faster than their arrows. Cities surrendered before a single siege engine was constructed, hoping for mercy, though mercy was a commodity in short supply. By 1260, Aleppo had fallen. Damascus, the ancient capital, opened its gates. The Ayyubid dynasty, descendants of the great Saladin, crumbled into dust. The Mongol war machine seemed invincible, an inexorable tide washing away history itself. Standing alone on the precipice of this disaster was the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. Cairo remained the last bastion of Islamic power in the region, the final obstacle preventing the Mongols from sweeping across North Africa and potentially into Europe. But Egypt was unstable. The Mamluks were a unique phenomenon in history, a caste of warrior slaves, purchased as boys from the Turkic steppes, converted to Islam and trained with a rigorous discipline that turned them into elite fighting machines. They had only recently seized power for themselves, overthrowing their Ayyubid masters. Their Sultan Qutuz was a man of iron will, a usurper who had taken the throne in the face of the existential threat looming on the horizon. He knew that the survival of his people, and perhaps the survival of the faith itself, rested on his shoulders. The tension in Cairo was palpable when the Mongol envoys arrived. They did not come to negotiate, they came to demand submission. They carried a letter from Hulagu that was a masterpiece of intimidation. It spoke of the Mongols as soldiers of God, sent to punish the wicked. It listed the nations they had destroyed and mocked the defenses of Egypt. It was a demand for unconditional surrender, a demand that Qutuz tear down his walls and submit to the yoke of the Khan. In any other era, against any other enemy, a ruler might have capitulated to save his city from the fires that consumed Baghdad. But Qutuz was a Mamluk. He had been born on the steppe. He understood the Mongol mind because, in many ways, he shared their martial heritage. Qutuz made a decision that would echo through the corridors of history. He did not send a diplomatic refusal. He did not offer gold. Instead, he ordered the execution of the Mongol envoys. Their heads were severed and hung from the Bab Zuwayla Gate in Cairo. It was a shocking breach of diplomatic protocol, a declaration of total war. With this act, Qutuz burned the bridges behind him. There was no going back. There would be no negotiation. It was victory or death. However, fate offered a sliver of hope to the Mamluks. Far to the east, the great Khan Monka died. Tradition dictated that the Mongol princes return to the capital in Mongolia to decide the succession. Hulagu, a potential contender for the title of Great Khan, withdrew the vast majority of his army from Syria, taking them east. He left behind a holding force, a tumen, approximately 10 to 20,000 cavalry, under the command of his most trusted general, Kitbuka. While reduced in number, this was still a formidable force, composed of battle-hardened veterans who had never known defeat. Kitbuka, an Nestorian Christian, was a brilliant tactician who viewed the conquest of the Holy Land with almost religious zeal. He believed the Mamluks, like everyone else, would scatter before the Mongol charge. Qutuz, realizing the numbers were now more even, seized the initiative. He would not wait for the Mongols to cross the Sinai Desert and besiege Cairo. He would do the unthinkable. He would march out to meet them. This was a strategic gamble of the highest order. Taking an army across the desert was perilous, and leaving Cairo exposed invited internal dissent. But Qutuz understood that morale was key. If he waited, fear would rot his army from the inside. By attacking, he projected confidence. He rallied the disparate Mamluk factions, calling for a jihad to defend their homes. Among his generals was a tall, blue-eyed warrior named Baibars, a man of immense physical strength and cunning who would play a pivotal role in the events to come. The Mamluk army, numbering perhaps 20,000 men, marched northeast. They moved with speed and discipline, crossing the sands and entering Palestine. Their first diplomatic hurdle was not the Mongols, but the remnants of the Crusader states. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, now reduced to a coastal strip centered on Acre, watched the approaching conflict with trepidation. The Crusaders hated the Muslims, against whom they had fought for centuries, but they were terrified of the Mongols. The stories of Christian cities being razed alongside Muslim ones had reached them. When Qutuz asked for safe passage and supplies, the Crusaders in Acre made a pragmatic choice. They would not fight alongside the Mamluks, but they would not hinder them. They granted safe passage and sold them provisions. This neutrality was crucial. It allowed Qutuz to move his army into position without fighting a war on two fronts. As the Mamluks advanced, Kitbuka, stationed in the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon, gathered his forces. He was not a man to shy away from a fight. Hearing of the Mamluk advance, he marched south to intercept them. The two armies were on a collision course, destined to meet in the Jezreel Valley, a place that had seen the clash of empires since the days of the pharaohs. The location was Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath. It was a valley bordered by the slopes of Mount Gilboa, offering water and terrain that could be utilized by a cunning commander. It was Sept. Ember 3, 1260. The heat of the late summer hung heavy over the valley. The dust kicked up by thousands of horses obscured the sun, creating a hazy, dreamlike atmosphere. On one side stood the Mongols, the undefeated masters of mobile warfare, confident in their superiority. On the other stood the Mamluks, the only force in the region with the discipline, armor, and archery skills to match them. The battle began at dawn. The Mamluk plan, devised by Qutuz and Baibars, relied on deception. They knew they could not withstand the full shock of a Mongol heavy cavalry charge in the open. They needed to dictate the terms of the engagement. Baibars led the vanguard, a smaller force that rode out to taunt and engage the Mongols. His mission was dangerous. He had to fight well enough to be convincing, but he had to eventually break and run. Kitbuka, watching from his position, saw the Mamluk vanguard and took the bait. He ordered his troops to charge. The ground shook as the Mongol heavy cavalry, armored in lamellar cuirasses and wielding lances and maces, thundered forward. Baibars and his men fought a series of skirmishes, firing arrows and wheeling away, slowly drawing the Mongols deeper into the valley. This was the classic Mongol tactic, the feigned retreat, being used against them. For hours, the cat-and-mouse game continued, with Baibars pulling the Mongol lines further and further into the trap. The main Mamluk army was hidden in the hills and the tall reeds of the valley floor, waiting for the signal. Qutuz watched, his heart pounding, as the Mongols stretched their formation, their horses tiring in the heat, their aggression blinding them to the terrain. When the Mongols had fully committed themselves to the pursuit, reaching the narrowest part of the valley, the trap was sprung. Qutuz gave the signal. Kettle drums thundered across the valley, a terrifying rhythmic booming that signaled the attack. From the hillsides, thousands of Mamluk cavalry poured down, smashing into the Mongol flanks. The hunters had become the hunted. The shock must have been immense. For the first time, the Mongols found themselves surrounded, pinned against the hills. But the Mongols were not easily broken. Even in the face of an ambush, their discipline held. They were veterans of campaigns from China to Poland. They regrouped with terrifying speed, turning to face the new threat. The battle devolved into a brutal melee. It was a clash of titans, horse against horse, steel against steel. The air was filled with the screams of dying men and animals, the clash of swords and the whistle of arrows. The Mamluk hand cannons, early gunpowder weapons used to frighten horses, added to the chaos with flashes of fire and smoke. The fighting was ferocious. At one point, the Mongol left wing smashed into the Mamluk lines with such force that the Egyptian formation began to buckle. Panic rippled through the Mamluk ranks. Men began to look for a way out. The specter of the invincible. The Mongol horde rose up in their minds. The fear that they were fighting demons, not men, began to take hold. If the line broke now, it would be a slaughter. Egypt would fall, and the light of their civilization would be extinguished. It was in this moment of crisis that Sultan Qutuz etched his name into legend. Seeing his men wavering, he did not send orders from the rear. He rode into the center of the chaos. In a dramatic gesture, he tore off his helmet and threw it to the ground, exposing his face to the enemy and to his own men. He raised his sword and screamed, "Wa Islama! Oh my Islam!" It was an electric moment. The sight of their sultan, bareheaded and fearless, charging into the thickest part of the fighting, shamed the Mamluks and ignited a fire in their hearts. They rallied. The panic evaporated, replaced by a grim determination. They followed Qutuz into the fray, hacking and slashing with renewed vigor. The tide began to turn. The sheer weight of the Mamluk numbers, combined with their heavy armor and the exhaustion of the Mongol horses, began to tell. Kitbuka, the Mongol general, fought like a lion. Even as his army disintegrated around him, he refused to retreat. When his horse was shot out from under him, he continued to fight on foot. But the day was lost. The Mongol army, for the first time in generations, broke. They did not just retreat, they were shattered. Some fled into the nearby reeds, where they were hunted down and burned out. Others tried to flee north, but were pursued by Baibars and his riders. Kitbuka was captured and brought before Qutuz. The dialogue recorded by historians, though perhaps embellished, captures the clash of ideologies. Kitbuka, defiant to the end, warned Qutuz not to be proud of this momentary victory. He promised that when Hulagu heard of this, the wrath of the Khan would be boundless, and the earth would be leveled from Iraq to Egypt. Qutuz, the former slave who had just saved the world, simply ordered the general's execution. The head of Kitbuka was sent to Cairo, a gruesome trophy to prove that the nightmare was over. The Mongols could bleed, they could die, they could be beaten. The aftermath of Ain Jalut was immediate and profound. The spell of Mongol invincibility was broken forever. As news of the victory spread, cities throughout Syria that had surrendered to the Mongols rose up in revolt. The Mongol garrisons were expelled or killed. In a matter of weeks, the Mongol hold on the Levant collapsed. The Mamluks were hailed not just as the rulers of Egypt, but as the saviors of Islam. The legitimacy of the Mamluk Sultanate was cemented in blood. They would go on to rule for centuries, becoming the guardians of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, and the patrons of a new golden age of art and architecture in Cairo. However, the victory at Ain Jalut also carried the seeds of tragedy. On the return journey to Cairo, the camaraderie of the battlefield gave way to the treacherous politic. Of the court. Baibars, the hero of the vanguard, felt he had not been adequately rewarded for his role in the victory. He harbored resentment against Qutuz, dating back to old factional rivalries. During a hunting expedition, just days before the triumphant entry into Cairo, a conspiracy was hatched. Qutuz, the man who had stopped the apocalypse, was assassinated by his own generals. Baibars struck the killing blow or orchestrated it, depending on the account. He then rode into Cairo and declared himself Sultan. It is a bitter irony of history that Qutuz ruled for less than a year, yet his impact was eternal. He saved a civilization and was murdered by the very men he led to victory. Baibars, however, would prove to be a capable, if ruthless, ruler. He would spend the rest of his life fighting the Crusaders and the Mongols, ensuring that the victory at Ain Jalut was not a fluke but the foundation of a lasting empire. The significance of the Battle of Ain Jalut cannot be overstated. It is one of the true turning points in human history. Had the Mongols won, there was nothing standing between them and the Atlantic Ocean. The systematic destruction that had visited Baghdad would likely have visited Cairo, Tunis, and perhaps even Rome or Paris. The Islamic world, already reeling from the loss of its eastern territories, might have been completely subsumed, its culture and knowledge lost to the fires of the steppe. Instead, the Mongol advance was halted. The Mamluks established a frontier on the Euphrates that the Mongols would never permanently breach. The center of the Islamic world shifted from the ruined Baghdad to Cairo, which blossomed into the greatest city of the Mediterranean. Scholars fleeing the Mongol advance found refuge there, preserving the scientific, medical, and philosophical texts that would later filter into Europe and help spark the Renaissance. The battle also marked the beginning of the end for the Mongol Empire as a unified entity. The defeat at Ain Jalut exacerbated the internal divisions among the Mongol princes. Hulagu, furious at the death of Kitbuka, wanted revenge, but he was distracted by a civil war with his cousin Berk Khan, the ruler of the Golden Horde in Russia. Berk had converted to Islam and was horrified by Hulagu's destruction of Baghdad. The two Mongol Khanates turned on each other, saving the Mamluks from the full wrath of a return expedition. Ain Jalut had shown the world that the Mongols were not demons, but men who could be outthought, outmaneuvered, and outfought. Today, the valley of Ain Jalut is quiet. The clash of steel and the thunder of hooves have long since faded, replaced by the sounds of agriculture and the wind moving through the grass. But if one listens closely to the echoes of history, one can still hear the desperate prayers of the soldiers, the war cries of the steppes, and the shout of a sultan throwing his helmet to the ground. It was there, in the dust of the Jezreel Valley, that the tide of history turned. It was there that the unstoppable force met the immovable object. It was there that the world was saved, not by a king born in a palace, but by a soldier who had once been a slave. The legacy of Ain Jalut serves as a reminder of the fragility of civilization. In 1260, the continuity of culture and progress hung by a thread, dependent on the courage of a few thousand men standing their ground against a hurricane. It teaches us that history is not a predetermined river flowing in one direction, but a series of crossroads. At Ain Jalut, humanity took a turn away from destruction and toward preservation. The Mongols would remain a power for centuries, but they would never again threaten the total domination of the known world. The sun that had seemed to set on civilization rose again, over the minarets of Cairo, casting a light that would endure through the ages.